Greetings. It's been a little while. I've been doing some thinking, I've been doing some reading, and in particular, I've been reading The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien up to right now. I'm at the beginning of Return of the King. And I've been thinking about the findings that we've discovered about history, and in particular, the types of things that are featured by myself and others, such as UAPchannel, mainly about these structures that a lot of people don't understand because of the massive size of the blocks in the buildings and things like that. And an interesting thought that I had was that we wouldn't know to be able to disprove quite a few possibilities about the origin of those things. And you know what I think, that much of that is remnants from the Antediluvian world, which means before the deluge, before the flood world, and that we probably can understand the structures up to a point, but at a certain point we won't be able to understand because we weren't there. Obviously, that stuff goes without saying. But where the line is drawn, I think, is very interesting. And that line will always move back and forth, probably, because of the willful, not just the natural degradation of knowledge, but the willful suppression of not only knowledge, but inquiry. So you know, it's unfortunate, but that's the state of affairs. So whether that's justified or not, I'll leave that point. I don't even know or care to examine that. I've done what I did, and I am satisfied with it, and I don't need it to be out there. Anyway, what I want to continue is to examine things from the perspective of what we could gain. So, for example, the different technologies that were used, I would like to explore that, such as the district heating that I've touched on before. I find extremely interesting, the atmospheric energy, but also the aesthetics of it, the beauty. A lot of times we see these buildings that are taken down, and it's a crime. And you know how I am thinking about wars, and the purpose of wars a lot of times is just destruction by design. Yes, it may be somewhat about what it's supposedly about, but I don't think it would happen if there weren't other motives behind it, and one of them would be the destruction of architecture, as well as the displacement of people, and just a number of stressors that are prescribed for various regions or groups of people at different times. And but about the architecture, when things are rebuilt, they're just not the same. And one of the interesting points about that I have noticed almost every day since I first came upon it is that the buildings being built nowadays, for the most part, are of a much lower quality. They're not meant to last. And even large investments in properties, the construction from the very bare bones framework of it, I can tell right off the bat that that's not meant to be around 50 years from now. And it's somewhat concerning because we've seen all the destruction to the buildings that were built they were meant to be around for much longer than they were allowed to be. And comically, it was very difficult in some cases for the people in charge to demolish some of the structures they wanted to. And some of the buildings had, if you remember this, such structural integrity that the wrecking balls would bounce off, and they failed to demolish some of them. In the area near where I live in Northwest Ohio, and in the city of Toledo, there's a spot where now is a parking lot downtown, but previous to that was the Paramount Theater. And the Paramount Theater was beautiful. And there were a number of these types of theaters. Some of them are still around. Each individual building was a masterpiece, in my opinion, and none of them should have been destroyed. In the case of the one I'm speaking of, it was turned into a parking lot that wasn't really necessary. It's just a travesty, and the owners happen to be media moguls who were not so well loved. I don't know how things are today, but this is I don't know how long ago, I think in the 1960s or something, that they decided to tear it down for the parking lot. It just wasn't necessary, and you can't get that back. It's very difficult and very unlikely and pretty seldom that anybody would build a building of that magnificence nowadays. And if they did, it wouldn't have been built to last. Even if these buildings, these modern structures do last, well, is that such of a great thing when they're built in ways that you can't even get fresh air? You can't open windows in the building. You can't get natural sunlight. It's all through glass. The climate control requires the use of energy that is monopolized. That plus taxes. You wouldn't even want to own some of these buildings in some cases, in a certain sense. Obviously, if you are confident about the economy of the area, that can make sense. But I'm saying, just from a practical standpoint, the maintenance of these buildings nowadays, I think, is a lot higher than some of the old world structures. And I'm not saying that buildings like the Paramount Theater were antediluvian. By no means am I saying that. So I'm kind of mixing up different things. The antediluvian structures, for the most part, none of them would be lived in now. I mean, once they're buried, the original materials are replaced by minerals, and they're thought, in most cases, to have been carved out. But the shapes of those buildings, some of them are extremely intact. I'm thinking of, the supposedly carven, huge structures where it just wouldn't make sense. The only way you'd make sense of it is the joke that I made about rock carvers on meth going in and just going crazy and just carving all kinds of things, going up into the ceiling corners where there's just no point in continuing and just carving more and more like that. But there's a general degradation. I don't think that we even know how some of the antediluvian structures would have been made, not yet at least, what materials and how and why they did that. But in the old world, I call it old world buildings that were built, many of them in the 1800s, sometimes early 1900s, but oftentimes even older than the 1800s, were very magnificent. And it was cited in many cases of why a building would be demolished. It was cited that the maintenance of it would have been too costly, remodeling of it would have been too costly. But really, I don't believe that. In some cases, it may be true, but these buildings had natural heating and cooling and just simple things like being able to open windows. They designed them with cross breeze to accept the cross breeze. And even on a hot day, if you have a cross breeze and you have proper ventilation and shelter and oftentimes a basement, you can go different areas of the building and be comfortable. And then even in the coldest winters with the district heating that we learned about, it was no problem to heat some very large buildings, and you could have the windows open. It barely used much energy. In one case, I think the Empire State Building was said to have been heated by district heating, and it didn't use much of the boiling water from the central source, and they could have the windows open on the coldest day of winter in New York City, and it didn't really matter that much to the energy usage. It could would get so warm with the radiant heat that they would oftentimes have the windows open even in the winter time on certain floors. Of course, nowadays, with regulations and decisions made by the regulatory commissions, they make it so that even something that works isn't allowed to be used. So it's two different things. The Antediluvian, who knows? In some cases, it's the original materials really aren't really left. There are traces, and we could probably figure out what they were. In some cases, wood. Some cases, something could be made of straw and mud, but it's replaced with minerals, and people think it's a megalithic structure when actually it was made of different composite materials and just all filled in with minerals when it was submerged. And so there's a lot of research to be done. And where did all the water go? How could it have been submerged at that elevation? Things like that. There are answers. Some we may never know. Maybe we're not meant to know. But there is an answer. It's a physical answer. It may be mind-blowing. There are things alluded to, and well, I don't know if it's the Bible or some of the apocryphal texts. I think both, but there are allusions, not illusions, but allusions to chambers or gates that contain vast amounts of water, the deep, the great deep, things like that. And what do we really know? I mean, I was thinking the level of the ocean may have been much, much lower. And we do find a lot of structures and remnants of civilization under the sea level, quite a bit in some cases. I think one island in Japan is a great example where all around the outskirts of the island submerged under the ocean, like quite a bit, maybe 20 to 40 feet down. There are obvious structures. Nobody would have built that underwater or built stuff and then submerged it, but it has the look to be antediluvian anyway. There's Atlantis, there's the lost continent of Mu. There are many legends, many tales that we've covered and looked at. But also the migration of people. Would it make sense that you would have people getting on little boats and landing on these small islands really far away? Or would it make more sense that even after the Great Flood, maybe the water levels, maybe the ocean levels receded so quite a bit? And so one of the things I've been thinking about in these weeks and months, taking time, I thought about the Ice Age and how I've been saying that I really don't think the Ice Age was what they said it was. But then I thought, what if it was that way? So for example, where I am, Northwest Ohio, I'm roughly on the same latitude as Barcelona, Spain. But here it's said at the height of the Ice Age, they say 10,000 years ago. I say not that long ago, probably if there was, that we were under a glacier here as thick as a mile of ice. Now, a mile is quite a bit. I don't know if that would be the case, but let's say there was quite a bit of ice. Hundreds of feet of ice and a glacier just covered like the North Pole or something. Well, if it was that way and the Ice Age was that way, maybe we're just still on the tail end of the Ice Age and that it's just natural. So after a worldwide flood, then you have this Ice Age and the ocean levels are extremely low and then they keep rising and the earth warms, and it would make sense because there were most of civilization in ancient history is in warmer climates, closer to the equator. And then why there are also ancient civilizations and sites on tops of mountains, it may be that there was a lot of fear about ocean levels rising, because maybe it was noticeably quick in the past, and then it's a limit curve. As time goes to infinity, the rate gets less and less. So you see, where do you see the ancient people? You see them, usually they're further south. Usually they're at either lower elevations in some cases, not usually, but in some cases they're at lower elevations than sea level, sometimes by a lot. I think up to 40 feet, maybe a lot more. And there may have been entire continents. I'm thinking of the lost continent of Mu. I'm thinking of Atlantis, the island. There was an island apparently somewhere in the region of Ireland and Iceland. There's this other island that's now gone, but it was on a lot of maps. It was spoken of. In my research of the English Channel, it seemed that there was a path connecting England to France that was either an existing tunnel under the English Channel or there was a land bridge, something like that. But there's a lot of evidence to support some kind of connection long previous to the connection of the channel. There, even when speaking of technology, intercontinental cables, there were a lot of intercontinental cables laid down before even the first one became operational. They talked about so many already laid down that they had to lay it on a different track because it didn't really follow the logical contours of this, the shape of the geography and everything. To do it that way, they had some explanation. I thought it was a really interesting side note about their transcontinental cables and the history of it when those were first laid down, that the path that they took was not what you would think it would be. It wasn't the closest or straightest, shortest distance. And they said, not because of the geography of the landscape at the bottom of the ocean where it would go through, something like that, like some volcano, or I don't know what it would be. But they said that there were just so many other cables they didn't want to deal with tangles or confusion when they would have to pull one up, because there were already so many laid down, yet there had never been a successful transcontinental cable laid down up to that point. I think it was 1856 when they started laying that, the one that finally worked. But before that, they were already supposedly doing that. I just find it fascinating. It raises more questions, but certainly I think there was a worldwide network, worldwide communication going way, way back to Jesus' time and even before. I think that the methods may have been different. The length of time to get a message or to travel continent to continent may have been different, but the look and the layout of things was extremely different, I think. And so I come back to the point I was reading J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers. I'm finished with that. Now Return of the King. But I was thinking about the Tales of Middle-earth and how they talk about how things change. Once they, spoiler alert, after the One Ring is destroyed, then they have the New Age, the Age of Man. And so then the magical things lose their magic power, and these great ancient entities and beasts and things of old, things with many names that have survived centuries or millennia, they fade away. They just don't have a place on Middle Earth anymore. Well, how crazy would it be to, especially when you're looking at these ancient structures, the Antediluvian ones, what's left of them, how crazy would it really be to say that things were just so different back then? And how would we know? Again, it's just, what if some of these myths, these legends and tales of old that seem so fantastical, what if they were true, or mostly true, or somewhat true, or elements of them were true? It's all possible. It's all on the table, and it's something that begins as a laughable thought, but the more you ponder it, it certainly can't be disproven, but you think maybe it would make sense in a lot of ways. And then the leftovers, the things that remain, some of these things that you would read in a fantasy book, such as Lord of the Rings, would better explain some of the crazy, I would say, supernatural things that we see even in modern times, to explain a lot of that, how it works. If something akin to magic like that we were still around, and it's a blurred line between technology and magic, and where it comes from can be fascinating. And we can look into that. For example, the transistor, how it came about. It's an unusual story, and it's got all the telltale signs of, well, involvement and planning that wouldn't make sense to be there from agencies that aren't known for coming up with technologies on their own. Like governments don't usually do that. They usually acquire it, but from where? When the original story is that somebody who worked closely with government then invents something, it's possible, but it's also like the Nikola Tesla stories. It's got a lot of intrigue as far as I'm concerned. So anyway, that's at least something to chew on, and hopefully enjoyed listening to this, and we'll talk next time.